What happens when a simple act of kindness leads to an unexpected chain of events? When a waitress risks everything for a man with nothing, only to face consequences she never saw coming. This is a story of compassion, regret, and a twist no one saw coming. The rain hammered against the pavement as Emily rushed through the restaurant doors, shaking the water from her thin jacket. The smell of sizzling burgers and fresh coffee filled the air, mixing with the chatter of exhausted truck drivers and late-night diners. She tied her apron around her waist and hurried to her station, just as her manager's voice cut through the kitchen. "Table 6 is waiting, Emily. Move it!" She grabbed a notepad and rushed over, flashing a polite smile at the elderly couple sipping their soup. But as she took their order, her eyes flickered toward the window, where a figure sat alone outside, drenched from head to toe. A homeless man. His thin frame shivered under a ragged coat, and his fingers curled into his palms, trying to find warmth. His eyes darted toward the customers' plates, hunger flickering behind them. Emily's stomach twisted. She had seen him before. He always lingered near the alley, never begging, never asking, just watching, as if hoping someone would notice. Tonight, she did. Steeling herself, she glanced toward the kitchen, where her manager, Frank, was busy barking orders at the staff. Without thinking twice, she grabbed a fresh plate of food from the counter, carefully balancing it as she slipped toward the door. The bell above the entrance jingled softly as she stepped out. "Here," she said, placing the plate in front of the man. "It's warm. Eat while it's fresh." The man's eyes widened. I can't pay." Emily shook her head, smiling. "You don't have to." For the first time in what seemed like years, he smiled. He picked up the fork, his hands trembling as he took the first bite. Emily turned to go back inside, and walked straight into Frank's furious glare. Her stomach dropped. "Emily," he hissed. "My office. Now." The warmth in her chest vanished, replaced with a sinking dread. She had no idea that the moment she stepped into that office, her life was about to change forever. Emily followed Frank into the cramped office at the back of the restaurant, her heart pounding louder with each step. The door closed behind her with a sharp click, cutting off the comforting hum of the dining area. Frank spun around, eyes blazing with fury. "What the hell were you thinking?" he snapped, his fists clenching at his sides. "You gave away food, my food, to some bum off the street?" Emily swallowed hard, keeping her voice steady. "He was hungry, Frank. It was just one meal." Frank's face reddened. "One meal? You think this is some kind of charity? You're here to work, not hand out freebies to every stray you see?" Emily felt her cheeks burn, anger simmering beneath her fear. "It's just food. We throw out more than that every night." "It's not your call to make," Frank roared, slamming his hand on the desk. "You think you can just do whatever you want? Well, guess what? You're fired." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Fired. Just like that. Emily stared at him, stunned. "Frank, please. Get out." His voice was cold, final. "And don't bother coming back." Tears stung her eyes as she untied her apron and let it drop to the floor. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office, out of the restaurant, and into the rain-soaked night. She didn't know where she was going or what she'd do next. All she knew was that her small act of kindness had cost her everything. But as she walked away, head bowed against the downpour, she didn't see the figure watching from the shadows. A tall, imposing man, dressed in a sleek black coat, his eyes sharp and thoughtful. He had witnessed everything, the kindness, the confrontation, the unjust firing, and he had plans of his own. Because this mysterious stranger, he wasn't just anyone. He was the owner of the entire restaurant chain, and Emily had no idea her life was about to change again, this time in a way she could never have imagined. What do you think so far? Ready to keep this story rolling? The rain poured relentlessly as Emily trudged down the sidewalk, her shoes soaked, her mind racing. Fired, just for feeding a hungry man. Her hands clenched into fists as she replayed the scene in her head. Did Frank really think she'd regret helping someone? She wouldn't, not for a second. But now, She had no job, no paycheck, and rent was due in a week. Behind her, the restaurant bustled on like nothing had happened. Customers kept eating, waiters kept serving. And Frank? He was probably back to barking orders, completely unfazed by what he'd done. But one man hadn't moved. The tall figure in the sleek black coat remained near the entrance, watching her disappear into the storm. His jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, he stepped inside. The moment he entered, Frank straightened up, sensing authority before even recognizing the man. "Sir, welcome. You're Frank, correct?" The man's deep voice cut through the restaurant noise like a blade. Frank blinked. Yes, sir. And you are?" The stranger slid off his wet coat, draping it over a chair. His sharp eyes scanned the room, the staff, the customers, before landing back on Frank. "I'm Daniel Carter," he said smoothly. "Owner of this restaurant and the entire chain." Frank's face drained of color. The few waiters who overheard froze mid-step, their eyes widening. A nervous silence fell over the room. Daniel didn't look angry. Worse, he looked disappointed. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and steepled his fingers. "Tell me, Frank, I saw what happened just now. A waitress, Emily was it, fired on the spot for giving food to a homeless man." Frank forced a smile, shifting uncomfortably. "Sir, Tell me why." Frank hesitated. His mind raced for an excuse, a way to make himself look good. But under Daniel Carter's cold, unwavering stare, every lie crumbled before he could even speak it. The silence stretched. Then Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, but firm. "I built this business from the ground up, not just for profit, but for people, for community." He tilted his head. "Do you know what I value most, Frank?" Frank swallowed hard. "Quality service?" Daniel's lips twitched. "Number character." Frank opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the front door swung open with a gust of wind. Emily. She stood in the doorway, drenched, breathless, clearly debating whether she should have come back at all. Her eyes met Daniel's. And that was the moment everything changed. Emily hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she had made a mistake by coming back. The warmth of the restaurant clashed with the cold rain clinging to her skin, but what truly made her freeze was the way everyone was staring at her. And then her eyes landed on him, the man in the black coat, the one who had been watching. She didn't know who he was, but something about his presence made the air feel heavier, like a storm had gathered inside the restaurant, waiting to break. Frank's voice cut through the tension. "You shouldn't be here, Emily." His usual arrogance was laced with unease now. He kept darting glances at the mysterious man like he was trying to figure out how much trouble he was in. Emily squared her shoulders, forcing herself to meet Frank's gaze. "I just came to get my last paycheck." Daniel Carter leaned back in his chair, studying her. The confidence in her voice, despite everything, impressed him. "Come here," he said, his tone neutral but commanding. Emily's brows furrowed. Sorry, but who are you?" Frank visibly tensed, but Daniel simply gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit." Something about the way he said it made it impossible to refuse. Slowly, Emily walked forward and lowered herself into the chair. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "You gave that man food, knowing it could cost you your job." Emily frowned. Yeah, I did. Why?" She blinked. "Because he was hungry." Daniel let that answer settle in the air. Simple, honest. No excuses, no over-explanations. Then he looked at Frank. "And you fired her for that?" Frank let out a nervous chuckle. "Sir, with all due respect, we can't just hand out free meals to every homeless person who walks by. It's bad for business." Daniel exhaled slowly. Bad for business. He nodded, tapping his fingers on the table as if considering the words. Then, his gaze sharpened. "Tell me, Frank, how much food does this restaurant throw out every night?" Frank hesitated. "Well, I mean, a bit, but how much?" Daniel repeated, his voice leaving no room for games. Frank swallowed. A lot. Daniel tilted his head. So instead of letting a hungry man eat, you'd rather let perfectly good food rot in the trash? Frank's mouth opened and closed. He had no good answer for that. The restaurant was dead silent. The waitstaff, the cooks, even the customers, they were all watching, waiting. Then Daniel turned back to Emily. You still want your paycheck? Emily's stomach twisted. Was he about to throw her out like Frank did? Was this just another way to humiliate her? She nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. Daniel smirked. Good, because you're not getting it. Her heart dropped. Instead, you're getting a promotion. The entire restaurant gasped. Emily's head snapped up. What? Frank nearly choked. Excuse me? Daniel leaned forward, his smirk turning into a full smile. Frank was right about one thing. This place can't afford people who make bad business decisions. He turned to Frank. That's why you're fired. Frank staggered back. Wait, what? No, you can't. I can. And I just did. Daniel's voice was smooth, absolute. Get out. Frank's face twisted with rage, but he knew there was nothing he could do. Security had already stepped forward, ready to escort him out. His jaw clenched as he grabbed his coat and stormed toward the door, shoving past Emily on his way out. Daniel turned back to her, his expression calm once again. Now, let's talk about your future. Emily couldn't breathe. One moment, she had nothing. The next, she had everything. But before she could even process what was happening, the homeless man she had fed earlier stepped forward from the corner of the room. His voice was quiet, but steady. Sir, if I may. Daniel's brow lifted. You have something to say? The man nodded. Yeah, I do. And you're going to want to hear it.